Hello, everyone. My name is Welheimina Brempong, and I am the program coordinator for the Cleveland Minority Organ Tissue Transplant Education Program, MOTTEP for short. Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Cleveland MOTTEP Let's Talk About Vaccines podcast. Our vaccine education program is aimed at increasing confidence in COVID-19, flu, RSV, and children's vaccinations in our target neighborhoods, the Huff and University Circle neighborhoods. Funding for these efforts are made possible by the Centers for Disease Control Foundation, as well as the Centers for Dialysis Care Foundation. With these funds, we've been able to hire community educators to attend community events, host vaccine clinics and workshops, as well as targeted COVID-19 and influenza messaging in the greater Cleveland community. We've also been able to have public service announcements on Channel 5, as well as host this podcast. Thank you for joining us on Cleveland MOTTEP's Let's Talk About Vaccines podcast. Today, I am joined by Carrie Gibbons. Carrie, before we get started, we're going to start with a little icebreaker. So, Carrie, if you were a superhero, what would your superpower be, and how would you use it in your work?
Well, hello there. And if I was a superhero, I would be a superhero that's a builder.
Okay.
That with the clap of my hands, I can make housing structures appear. And how I would use that in my work is I would house the unhoused.
Okay, great. So, Carrie, can you give us a little information about yourself? So what's your job title, who you work with, and the population you serve?
Very good. So my name is Carrie Gibbons. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm the director of LGBTQ outreach and navigation services through the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, otherwise known as NEOC.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of services does NEOC offer?
So NEOC provides outreach services to those who are unhoused. We provide advocacy and education for those who are housed as well as unhoused. And we also we do organizing.
Okay.
And so in that, all of those layers of advocacy and education and outreach are all done with the organizing as our heart of the matter.
Okay. So with our podcast, we kind of like to talk about COVID-19 first, because that is like the biggest pandemic that has happened and vaccination efforts being started. So can you tell us about, one, your personal experience with COVID? Mm-hmm. Did you ever have it? Mm-hmm. Did you, any of your family members? What were your even initial thoughts when like everything started?
So in May of 2020, I actually was hired to work for NEOC, the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. And I remember that, during that time, there was so much fear, there was so much anxiety, stockpiling masks and toilet paper and paper towels and making sure that we're sanitizing things before they come into the house. But what I really was so proud of when I started doing this work was the community aspect that NEOC was providing for not only those who were unhoused, but also throughout the social services. And so my personal experience with COVID, so as soon as vaccines became available, I drove all the way out to the Cuyahoga County Fairgrounds.
Okay, wow.
I stood in a line. I made sure that, there was all these ways to sign up. And, luckily, our executive director, Chris Nestrick, was, very much like getting our staff to go get vaccinated, right? And so I actually, being a survivor of a traumatic brain injury, anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, I was very nervous to get my vaccine because I was nervous about the side effects. Right. And lo and behold, I did have some pretty gnarly side effects.
Wow.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And my coworkers, most of them were like, it's fine. Just, keep it moving. And I was like, it laid me out.
Wow.
Yeah. But my personal experience with COVID and actually getting it, I had it 3 times.
Wow.
Yeah. And that also was with being vaccinated all the way up through boostering. The first time was December of 2020. And that was just kind of, the symptoms you would expect, flu-like, tired, very tired, but also like couldn't sleep well, just the whole gamut. Actually, my whole family, my partner and I got it. And then I got it again that following November.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
So the holidays were canceled, and I was very, very sad because I bought a turkey.
Yeah, that happened to me as well.
Yeah.
My first Christmas here, I was like, oh, I have COVID. I got to go back home.
Right.
So
yeah. And actually that one, that particular time, it was very much, the symptoms that we know COVID to have, the flu-like as well. But this one was a bit more challenging because it laid me out in a fatigue way that like I had never experienced. And so, for me, just growing that awareness and really just wanting to stay in a place of like masking and making sure that like I'm keeping the people around me safe. And I quarantined for way too long. And that particular time, it was just me who my family wasn't impacted. It was just me. And so that was the isolation component became really difficult during that particular instance. So the journey of COVID, and then the last one was what's the name of the Paxlovid?
Yeah.
So I took that. And
Okay.
it was a hop, skip, and a jump.
Okay.
It was like a cold.
Yeah.
But again, like we were, vaccinating and like doing protocols and making sure that, everything was staying safe. And sometimes that exposure just happens in a, blink of a sneeze.
Right.
So yeah, that was my...
So thank you for sharing that. Catching COVID 3 times is wild. So how and when did NEOC first like become aware about the COVID-19 threat? Because I can imagine like the population you serve on top of like also this like pandemic that no one has much information about could not have been like a recipe for anything good out there.
Correct. So the beautiful thing is I wasn't employed by NEOC at that point, but the team went out to this encampment that was very well populated, and they had packed up a bunch of tents and supplies, and winter was, here.
Yeah.
And so they were, because again, I hadn't been employed yet, they were, ready to plan B it. And then the executive director, Chris Nestrick, shows up, and the way my colleague Dennis tells the story is that he, had all these things in his truck, but he sat in his truck and he was on the phone. And then like 10 minutes later, he gets out and he was like, we're all going to the hotel.
Okay.
And so in that time frame, I'm sure in communicating with the city and the county and like being able to make an access point into a non-congregated living situation, it was a game changer for those who were unhoused, because it allowed them to have a room. It allowed to have them 3 meals a day.
Right.
And it also allowed to have them access points of, health and wellness were coming to them.
Right.
Including COVID vaccines, right? And so with that moment, and PPEs were, starting to get tricky to obtain. But again, the fighting forces at NEOC were able to have all the things that we readily needed. We were one of the only organizations that was still transporting clients.
Wow.
And so being able to not only have that level of commitment to those we're serving, but also allowing us to stay safe in the process.
For sure. Especially COVID being airborne, like just imagining like hearing about it and then also still transporting clients, that's a lot. That's the real dedication and real passion. So I wanted to know, what unique challenges did you guys face during the pandemic that might not be obvious to us, besides like, the stuff that we obviously would get, right? Like, inadequate housing, stuff like that. Was PPE hard to find? Was other supplies really hard to find? Or even getting it to your population? How was that?
So the most interesting thing that was such a struggle was having individuals keeping their mask on their nose, especially in the non-congregate settings, right? Like when you're in your room, you can do what you want. When you come out of your room, like to get food, so on and so forth, like we need you to have it covering your face.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of disconnect when it came to like why this is important, right? Because as we're learning about it via television, let's not forget like Wine with DeWine.
Right.
We were getting those hourly updates, but when you're unhoused and you don't have access to Wi-Fi, you don't have access to, even a radio that could tell you like what the protocols are and why they're important. And there was a lot of misinformation that was going around too. I believe there was a point where folks were, just saying you can ingest certain chemicals and that would be preventative.
Right.
And folks would hear that faster than they would hear the real CDC information.
Right.
So that brought a lot of pause to me around trying to enforce something that feels flexible. Right. Like a mask feels like, why am I doing this? Why do I have to continue to do this? But the reality is that we were keeping each other safe. And when we could have those one-on-one conversations, folks were able to understand.
Gotcha.
But I think one of the biggest things of the invisibility of the homeless community, particularly during COVID, was, yes, there were things that were, like, yes, we could get tests.
Right.
However, they mailed them to us.
Right.
So if you're unhoused, how are you getting that? Right. Yes, we're, able to, I remember when we had to go get blood tests, right?
Yeah.
So like, where's that access point?
Right.
So like those little nuances for things that seemed easier for us were actually quite challenging.
Right. And then, so let's talk about that. So were there any specific services or programs that stepped up to kind of help you guys with like getting the tests to the community, or like, did you guys have volunteers that even stepped up? So
there was huge amounts of volunteerism, as well as Metro Health stepped up huge. They have their medical bus, and they would come in.
Wow.
There would be doctors there at least 3 to 4 times a week. There was incentivizing to get the vaccination. At one point, I believe it was like $50.
Wow.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Maybe Pfizer did that. I don't know. Don't quote me on that.
I mean, insurance, all that.
But then, like, there were other folks who stepped up and would do laundry for folks, right?
Oh, wow.
Like, you know, those basic essentials that at a hotel you don't necessarily have. But, like, you know, the decency and the love for community became so apparent, even though we needed to be six feet apart.
Yeah.
And, you know, many providers locally, university hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, like there weren't a moment where folks weren't like, how can I help? And not to mention like the frontline staff members that were like, I'm not gonna, you know, go inside and stay there. Like I'm showing up here Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 or whatever my shift is. Yeah.
Right.
So it was a truly beautiful component of the work that we do.
No, I'm so happy to hear that. You talked a little bit about misinformation, but I kind of wanted to touch on mistrust. Do you think the population you serve, the unhoused community, has mistrust of the healthcare institutions or government entities?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So how did that play out with the pandemic and vaccinations?
There was individuals who just would have to sign and say, I refuse.
Okay.
I refuse. This is, and again, we have to remember that there were a lot of misnomers that were coming into play. And, the reality is that if you're getting a bit of information, let's say, and also perhaps you're struggling with stability, not only physically, but also mentally, right? To hear that you have to do this or take this and you've been living this independent life, it's really challenging to bring that, to fill that gap with someone who's very determined in their no.
Right.
And the hard part is that, you know, we would know who said no, and then they had certain things that they would like. You have to make sure, like when the masks were lifted, like you still had to wear a mask, right? Like, so there were certain steps that we tried to ensure safety for everyone, even though there was a no. But I think the bigger thing is that, you know, I think it was like a wonderful rate of maybe like 95% of individuals who are in the hotels would get vaccinated. And that was because there were providers there to speak directly, to talk about what this meant, how it meant, and the reality versus what you may be hearing from an alternative source.
Gotcha. And then were you privy to how they approached the conversations about vaccines with the people who were hesitant or even skeptical at all? Did they try at least to like give them the information, or not persuade them, or like, you know, just be like, hey, you know, you should probably get this. You know what I mean?
There definitely was encouragement from all parties, right?
That's good.
So there was like direct line staff at the hotel programs, as well as the medical providers who would be there, and there definitely would be like, hey, so and so individual, you should go do this. Right. And then there would be like a check-in person, and the check-in person would be like, okay, you should. Here's why. And then the administrator of the vaccine would be like, this is good for you.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Were there any factors that you guys noticed? Was it particularly older people, younger people, women, men, non-binary, et cetera, et cetera?
The thing that I noticed was more older. I'm older, I would say 50 plus women.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting.
But there were definite societal pressures that those individuals were definitely not interested in participating.
Gotcha. Could you expand on that?
Meaning like they moved to the beat of their own drum.
Gotcha.
Right? And their lens was, this is not good for me, and therefore I'm not going to do it.
Right.
There was more of a perception that it would cause more harm than good. But again, more often than not, that conversation could be shifted over time.
Okay.
And that was also the beautiful thing, is that it wasn't just a one and done. It was a weekly participation.
Gotcha.
You know, sign up here and you can, you know what I mean? So like that was, and again, some people, you know, did just say no.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Tell me.
Did you guys, you said you got hired after COVID, but I don't know, was there an incentive to get vaccinated? Because I know when we hosted vaccine clinics, our incentive was here's a $25 gift card, come get vaccinated. Everyone could use $25 gift card to the grocery store. So
For the population we served, yes, there was an incentive.
Okay.
And that was definitely time specific.
Right.
So like if you missed that boat, you just missed that boat.
Right. It makes sense.
And so it was kind of like, well, sorry, not sorry.
Yeah. And so talking about vaccinations, how did you guys address like paperwork and like information, like because people are unhoused, they don't really have addresses, insurance, all those little things. Was ID needed when it was when they were easy to access, I guess people were a little more lenient, but as it progressed, how did you guys handle that?
So again, when folks were in the non-congregate shelter, it was through Metro.
Okay.
If you had an ID, they would, you know, and insurance, they would obviously do that. But also we didn't want to add more barriers. I know that for the staff, when we did sign up through I believe it was the Ohio Department of Health, we very much needed the documentation and the card and to keep it with us. And I even remember we went out to a conference, and like the conference still needed our COVID card, as well as making sure that we are boosted.
Right.
So I think, the beautiful part when folks were, either in shelter or non-congregate shelter during that first year of COVID, that the access points were provided in a way that the barriers of what normally would exist weren't there, right? So like IDs, insurance, like that kind of stuff. They did still want to track, obviously, right? Like, so if there was a sign-up sheet, folks could sign up. But for the most part, it was low to no barrier.
Gotcha. After, how did you guys communicate with your population about the importance of vaccinations, like after the initial pandemic? You know what I mean? Because obviously we moved into like, okay, 1 shot, 2 shots, booster. And every year now it's updated and it's become like the flu. How do you guys handle messaging about vaccination in general?
So, wonderful question. During the height, right? Like we were very it was word of mouth.
Right.
Like we knew that if you went to 2100 on Tuesday, the Metro Health bus would be there and they're providing vaccines, right? Whether it's flu, whether it's COVID, whether it's, whatever they could do. But now, as we're in 2024, it's very different, right? Like the reality, like even myself, like I don't know when to go get a booster. Do I combine it with my flu? If I do that, what are going to be the side effects? And so I think as we've progressed in this new era of COVID existing, but not pandemic level, that the communication around the urgency as well as the necessity for boostering, I think is really diminished.
Okay.
Besides your org, of course.
Yes, besides us. And
right.
Thank you, CDC. Hold on, give me 1 second. Could you share with us a personal, or not a personal story, but a story from the pandemic that stood out to you while working with the population you work with?
So I started in May of 2020, and the population that at that time that I was working with was folks who identify as LGBTQ, folks who identify as pregnant, aged out of foster care, and or folks who may have experienced human trafficking. And I got a referral for a client who fled domestic violence, came to Cleveland, and was pregnant.
Wow.
And so we were going somewhere that needed, I forget where we were going, but we needed to go somewhere to have a negative COVID test.
Okay.
Because that was also, remember, we had to prove we weren't, and so we drove all the way out to Parma.
Yeah.
To this little strip mall looking shop.
Yeah.
Where they take your blood and then within 72 hours you'll have a result. Right? And I think we were part of we were going through something around trying to get her access to mom's stuff, right? And so I vividly remember the amount of legwork that we had to do as providers and also individuals participating just to have that negative COVID test, right? And then the even harder part is that 3 day of fear, because if you did test positive, then you had to leave where you were and go to the COVID isolation section of wherever that was, right? And then I'm in fear because and then it becomes, so I think what overall the beauty is that we all experienced it together in this way that even though we were afraid, when we got those results, we were like, okay, what can we go do? Right. And where do we have access to? And so I think as far as, and just the other beautiful thing was our team, that those first couple of months, we have NEOC vans, and they were able to have, 3 to 4 people in the van and just bring them directly to the hotel and have folks get in and get housed.
Wow.
Granted, there was still the time, where it took to get people housed, but it was a beautiful thing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Have you guys seen any long-term health effects of COVID-19 in the unhoused population? Has long COVID affected any of the people you guys serve at all? Do you know?
So I think that's another perspective. So unfortunately, we did have a coworker who passed away.
Oh no, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Rest in peace, Denise Moore, amazing human being. And I think the hardest part is when you're experiencing, being unstably housed or homeless, that the follow-up care component just isn't there.
Right.
And therefore, even if people did have long COVID, I don't think that, and I could be wrong, but from my perspective, oftentimes the clients I was working with, if they did get COVID, they weren't following up on long COVID, right? They were simply just trying to get out of the quarantine.
Yeah.
Because when you're in quarantine, you're away from community.
Right.
So I think that most of the time, I will say that I do know a couple of individuals personally who are diagnosed with long COVID. And I think that, it's really debilitating to your life. And I think because it's not a pandemic anymore, that we're really shying away from the awareness.
Yeah. You're okay. I agree. I think it's so interesting seeing how like COVID-19 messaging has moved from being like super urgent, super necessary to being like, oh, it's like the flu, like get your COVID-19, get your flu shot kind of thing. And it's like, well, yes, but also it's like people are still getting COVID. I remember when I started this job, my coworker from my previous job, she had just gotten COVID, and so did her literally newborn baby. So it's like, we're still getting it. People are still getting it, still severe symptoms. Some people maybe not, but it's still a thing that's going around. Are there any programs or even supports in place to help people post-pandemic? And also like, how do your health services work, right? Like, how do you guys, is there a program that like, oh, if you have a health issue, like how do you guys deal with those kinds of things? Because I can imagine it would be hard with the unhoused population.
Yeah, so the beautiful thing is that we do have a couple relationships with Metro Hospital as well as the centers. And, they go out on outreach with my colleagues. And, they're able to check in on folks who really are adverse to going inside and or adverse to going to the hospital, right? And I think the story there isn't because the individual genuinely doesn't want to. It's also because that individual has been dismissed for so many reasons, on top of being unhoused, right? So it's like, yes, like I have this wound on my foot, but if I go to the ED, they're just going to put a Band-Aid on it, even though like I need it cleaned out and I need, A, B, C, and D, right? And so I think, being able to have doctors and psychologists and care providers go out with our team does provide another level of like care and building trust.
Right.
Because when you meet somebody where they're at, that's a whole different element of trust building.
Right.
And I think when it comes to, the unhoused community, oftentimes you want to fix the mental health component problem, right? And so there's resistance there.
Right.
And then if that resistance begins to build, then why would I want to fix my body problem?
Right.
And you kind of lean into the pain and just accept it as opposed to getting it fixed.
Right.
And I think oftentimes the perception of vaccines is a part of getting something fixed.
Right. Makes sense. Do you guys work on empowering your population to like advocate for themselves, right? Like they have the right to the access to healthcare. Like you are allowed to go to the doctor when you're sick and when you don't feel well. So,
and yeah, I mean, we advocate our clients. Housing is a human right. Healthcare is a human right.
Correct.
Right. Being authentically yourself is a human right. And the reality is that because homelessness represents so many marginalized communities, the intersectionality of the harms, you know, from societal pressures, from institutional pressures, and from people pressures, it does leave an impact on that individual who is stuck in a traumatic cycle. Right. And then it becomes, which element can we address first? And how can we build that deep trust where I'm coming here and saying, this is important for you. And how do I make that understood where you don't feel like I'm forcing something on you? Right.
Beautifully answered.
Oh, thank you.
Has the experience of COVID-19 changed the way your organization or team approaches vaccinations or other illnesses? Answer that first.
I think a general awareness has been really brought to our team.
Okay.
And again, you know, NEAC is here to eliminate the root causes of homelessness.
Right.
And oftentimes root causes come in the form of racism, ableism, right? And transphobia, homophobia, as well as like discrimination. And so when you add those components and add a layer of healthcare,
Right.
it really kind of makes it so hard, because if you know, just envision yourself outside, right? Today it's 39 degrees, right? And you have a tent. Everything hurts.
Yeah.
Right? And yet if you leave your tent, then you're even colder and you don't know if you can get to that doctor on West 25th, right? And when you arrive, you sit in the waiting room for several hours, although you're warm, right? But then you go see the doctor or the nurse practitioner, and they say nothing's wrong with you.
Yeah.
And then you have to walk back in the cold with nothing alleviated.
Yeah.
And I find that more often than not, when someone presents in any kind of institution, whether it is a hospital or a bank or a hotel, you know, that they are immediately rejected because of how they're appearing.
Okay.
And in that appearance, that doesn't mean that they don't need something.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they might provide something, right? Like there can be reciprocity. However, there's such an invisibility that the reciprocal nature of existence doesn't happen for folks who are unhoused.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't know if you answered that.
I don't know if I answered
But
that.
I loved it. It was beautiful. I loved listening to it. So let's go back to the question. Has the experience with COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy in general changed the way your organization or team approaches vaccinations for other illnesses? So has what you went through the pandemic changed the way you guys kind of respond now to vaccinations / illnesses?
I think I think so. Yes. Okay. I think that in a way we continue to do our best to be informed.
Right.
During that time, we also became a provider of the HOPWA program. So that's housing folks with HIV and AIDS.
Okay.
And so we definitely want to do our part because, you know, public health crises, homelessness is one of those.
Yeah.
So I think allowing for that exchange of, yes, we know that you have diseases or preventable, situations where you can get vaccinated. We are not a healthcare provider.
Right.
However, I think in our advocacy work and our organizing work, we definitely do our best to make sure that we can get messages out.
Important.
Very.
What do you think public health programs could learn about vaccine hesitancy from your experiences with the unhoused population? So what do you think like the county or the city or the state could learn from the unhoused community when it comes to vaccine hesitancy? It could be like strategies.
And truth of the matter is, when we reflect back to COVID,
Right.
or we reflect back to even monkeypox,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
The way that there was a dissemination of vaccines and effort was so grassroots oriented that they were going to where the people are.
Right.
And so if you simply continue to do that work, then therefore the provider of the vaccine is getting to the people who need it.
Right.
And the more often that you're saying, come to me, the less likely that you're going to be able to get what you need. Right. Yeah. And I think that that's the biggest takeaway. I mean, I remember standing with folks from the County Board of Health at the Mean Bowl, trying to get folks vaccinated. And so it's like, it can be that simple, right? Where we post up at a Browns game. That's a lot of people.
Always thinking.
Yeah. And they won't have, side effects for a couple days.
Yeah.
Because of the hangover.
No, I love Interesting. So I want to kind of close out with this question. So what has this experience taught you about resilience, both in yourself and in the communities you serve?
This experience has taught me that to show up with compassion and to be in community, that literally anything is possible. And the most beautiful part of it all is that the silos that we all exist in during that time dissipated.
Yeah.
And we collectively work towards keeping people safe.
Yeah, I agree. That was beautiful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on our Let's Talk About Vaccine podcast. This podcast is supported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It's part of a financial assistance award totaling $107,000 with 100% funded by CDC and HHS. The contents are those of myself and Carrie and do not necessarily represent the official views nor an endorsement by CDC, HHS, or the U.S. government or the CDC Foundation. Thank you.